Oh, okay. Mary, let me know when you're.
It's on.
You're good? Everybody, please. I know you met him on Saturday. This is the amazing Buell Cobb, wonderful scholar and performer in the shape note tradition, arguably the leading scholar, I would say. And he's written some beautiful books on the art form, and he's going to share his thoughts about shape note, his life in shape note with us today. And Buell, I'm just going to let the kids have at it. Would you like to say something first? Or?
Well, first of all, I'm naturally curious, how many of you made it Saturday to the...
Everybody was there.
Everybody was here, amazing. And so you thought you were going to be interviewing me. I'm now going to interview you. So what surprised you most, or did you find interesting about it?
I was surprised by the liveliness of it and also the volume, which is a compliment.
It's very different from what I've studied. I'm a music major, so I've studied different. I've taken Theory 1 and 2. And
Judy Hoff, who wrote some of the beautiful music that's in the Sacred Heart, she's at maybe 5 or 6 tunes, and she's in Chicago now. And when Ira Glass did an interview with us in 1991 for All Things Considered on NPR, Judy being interviewed, she said, "Sacred Heart breaks every rule I was ever taught." And she said, "You ought to try it because it's wonderful. It's liberating to break all those rules." Okay. Back to you now.
How were you introduced to shape note? And did you grow up in a house where it was sung?
No. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, used to mention fa sol la singing, it's called, or old harp singing. It was around in her days. Her father was supposedly a great bass singer in Sacred Heart, but he died when she was, I think, 14. And her sister was a treble singer, one of the parts. Back home we would have called it treble. So I heard references to it, and when I was a junior in high school, I think, I took my grandmother and grandfather to the local courthouse singing. Coleman, Alabama, is the last place in the country, and thus the world, to have an annual all-day courthouse singing, which says something about what a central role that Sacred Heart used to play. 30 of Alabama's 67 counties at one point had an annual courthouse singing. When you get the courthouse for free, that says that you're really up there. Gradually over time that went down just a couple. Unfortunately, that didn't make that much of an impression on me. I didn't connect with the music. We sat high up in a mezzanine around what was below this great host of singers singing very loud. So when I came to college, Uncle Tom Denson is responsible for what's known as the Denson book, the one you would have been singing from on Saturday. And one of his grandsons was in college with me and was a friend of mine. And when he heard some of us singing gospel music in the dorm, he pulled me aside at some point and said, "I've got something you should hear." And it was the first 2 record albums, 33 and a Third, that the Sacred Heart Publishing Company produced, the same people that put out the book. And I started playing that, and it was just like, wow, this is what I've come home, when I didn't even know I was away. It was such an elemental appeal. The fact that it sounded ancient, the fact that it resonated so deep, that pulsing beat throughout, the a cappella sound, those strong chords, so much minor music. I had not been used to singing that much minor music in church. About 30% of the songs in the Sacred Heart are in minor key. And you just don't find that in typical congregational singing, typically. So at that point, I started trying to penetrate what had become a subculture. It was no longer the culture. It was just sort of underneath there. A great many people in the South had grandparents who sang Sacred Harp, or great-great-aunt or great-uncle or something, but have not been doing it themselves. So the Sacred Harp seemed to be just going down, down, down. And so when I began singing in the mid-'60s, not only before you were born, before your parents were born, we wondered if the Sacred Harp would still be around in this century. It was overwhelmingly elderly people. And I'm answering more than, stop me if you...
I'll keep going.
The most amazing thing has happened then along the way. At some point, well, the internet was huge, beginning in the early 90s, and people like the great figure Hugh McGraw, who headed up the Sacred Heart Publishing Company for 40-something years. He was one of those people who had no hesitation at all, very bold and charismatic, and he took Sacred Heart outside the South to, in many cases, college towns where some few people knew about it and had been singing Sacred Heart on mimeograph sheets, Xerox sheets, or had ordered a few books or something. And gradually, it just began to grow. And so now, as you may know, it's all over the world. You can go to YouTube and just go. And Paris is having their first annual singing now. There's 6 cities in Germany that sing. It's in Australia. I think Tokyo is having their first annual singing. In Israel, they sing. In Tel Aviv, they sing, these same lyrics. Yeah.
Really, I'm curious. So you get into Sacred Heart in the 1960s. How would you say that the Shape Note revival of the 60s connected with the larger folk and blues revival of that time?
That's a great question. I think it was in 1956. You mentioned Alan Lomax, and everybody probably familiar with him. And he and other folklorists came down and tapped this. And you must know that there were 2 in Alabama, northern Florida, Texas, and Mississippi. There were both black and white traditions of Sacred Heart, typically separate, as the cultures existed separately. Sometimes they sang together, or some few from each. But he and others went down and recorded and spoke with singers from both traditions. And in 1956, a group of about 40 singers were invited to the Newport Folk Festival to perform. And so that back then was just this huge venue for them. And one of the, I think it was Joe Hickerson from the Smithsonian Institution, who said that when they got there, he said they went in a separate room somewhere and the walls were soon shaking with their sound because, of course, when they were together, what they wanted to do was sing. So things like that began to happen with the folk music. So there's always been that infusion going both ways. A lot of Sacred Harp singers have sort of taken that as a pejorative to be told that Sacred Harp is folk music, but they may not be realizing the broad context of that term, and certainly it is a folk music. It is very much a folk music. Not only bringing along all of these ancient folk songs that have been now transformed and put in with sacred lyrics to them, but the fact that it exists in a folk context.
What were this group of singers in the 60s that performed at that folk festival? What was their background, and what congregations were they from?
They were from Northwest Alabama, primarily. There may have been a few over the line in Mississippi. I don't think any of the singers from Georgia were along for that. And they were small farmers, small-time farmers, shopkeepers, that kind of thing, just mainly rural folk. There, might have been a doctor or a lawyer, but not basically. And primarily, you would say, uneducated or lightly educated people. They just knew Sacred Harp in their bones. They'd been doing it for the most part all their lives.
Buell, you were singing or interested in gospel music prior to your true introduction to Shema. What was the difference?
Oh,
You were already loving gospel music, apparently, so how did this sort of take it to the next level?
Yes. Well, and I wasn't making a study of that. But my grandfather, I mentioned my grandmother earlier. It's her husband. He had been a gospel book singing school teacher for 50 years. Are you familiar with those little manila-backed, paperback editions, Stamps Baxter and others? These folks may not be, but they were gospel songs that were sort of churned out year after year after year. And the roots of gospel music, a lot of it are in Sacred Harp and related things, but the differences are pretty apparent. The gospel music picked up on the wave of, quote, more educated music and so on. So much more chromaticism, for example. Well, any chromaticism for the most part, because you just don't find that in the Sacred Harp much at all. Much more music centered on the third, with plugging the chords. You didn't find the open fifths in gospel music, and instrumentation there, piano flourishes. Up and down they would play with it. And Sacred Harp singers have just never felt the need for that. And then the text. In Sacred Harp, I think even an objective view would be that there are these, a lot of text with gravity to them, and focusing on the themes of mortality, life, mortality, and then the afterlife. And gospel music tended to be more optimistic, flighty. And here was one that always tickled me, a title of one of the songs, My Nonstop Flight to Glory. That was written at a time when plane flights were becoming more common. You just wouldn't find that in the Sacred Harp. Instead, you have these august texts by Isaac Watts, just wonderful. And I think people today, both believers and unbelievers or non-believers, find a spiritual connection with the text that are in the Sacred Harp. Mixed in with what were revival spirituals from the early part of the 19th century. There are a lot of those in the Sacred Harp, too, where you would take little rhyming couplets and then attach a refrain to them that everybody in the congregation could sing without a book. And we'll all sing together in that morning, for example. I am bound for the Canaan land, or something like that, and sing those over and over again with these rhyming couplets.
What would you say shape note means to people who are not religious? Because the lyrics are very religion oriented, would they find different meaning in it?
It's going to be an individual reaction to that. I mean, the most striking example to me, I mentioned that they were singing in Israel right now. Almost by definition, if people in Tel Aviv are singing this and singing it in English, they're singing this, songs that just wouldn't fit with their theology and so on. And it's a testament, I think, to the power of Sacred Harp that people are able to do that and still find something in there that is meaningful to them. And those universal themes that it taps over and over again, and the spiritual connection seem to address that need.
Bill, do you think, obviously, these very stark themes of death and mortality played a very different role when the frontier was being settled and these shape note hymns were being compiled initially? Do you think today, though, I mean, for people, it's refreshing in a way that you're getting presented with a very non-sentimental view of life and death in these hymns?
For some people, for certain. You know, I guess others maybe find that a little off-putting. You know, somebody was just telling me over the weekend that a fellow who had been a shape note singer, he'd come to Sacred Heart, had been singing with him for some time, finally just said, "I'm not a worm, and so I'm out of here." So, in other words, he reacted to those songs that presented, human beings as worms, valueless, in this situation. But,
What do you find attractive about shape note singing?
Well, the music, first of all. It's a curious thing. So many of us know this to be a fact. If you process the population as a whole through Saturday singing down at the City Hall, some people would be completely turned off right from the start, wouldn't have been the least bit interested in it. Others would say, well, that's very nice. A telling comment would often be, well, that's interesting. And from that, they will never darken the door again. Some smaller percentage will say, I must do this. There's something about the music that just reaches out and pulls people in. I met someone over the weekend here, a fellow by the name of Mick, who has relocated here from another state to do what? To sing Sacred Heart. I know a couple, middle-aged couple in my old hometown of Coleman, who moved there to this medium-sized city now from California for Sacred Heart singing. So the first thing that attracted me was this music, and as I've described it to you, the open fifths, that basic elemental sound, the chordal harmony, the powerful pulsing rhythm of it. I love the a cappella part of it. The melodic nature of the songs themselves. And I don't know if you've had much of an opportunity to sing the harmonic parts. Were some of you able to do that? Let me give a demonstration that I intend to do for Bill's other class this afternoon.
By the way, everybody's invited to the 315 class upstairs, where singers from Cobb will just be singing.
Okay, let me just sing this little melody, and I want you to kind of appraise it as a melody. Think of it in terms of the melodic expectations you might have. Sol, la, fa, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, fa. Sol, la, fa, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, fa. Fa, sol, sol, la, sol, la, sol, 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 la, mi, la, sol, la, sol, sol, la, fa, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, la, sol, fa. Well, hearing that, you might think, I can hear the kind of the Celtic swing in that. But I think what's remarkable about that is that what I sang is not the melody of the song at all, but the bass part. Mm-hmm. And that is the ideal of Sacred Heart singing, is that each part have a melody of its own. not the full melody. Even the cadence points will always take you to the bass will always go down, and then the treble, maybe up, and the alto will hit right in the middle, rather than following what would normally be the melodic close. But that's the reason why you have to have four staffs here, is that the four voice parts cross, as they don't, if you well know, in congregational music. In congregational music, the high part, the soprano, carries the melody, and it would never be below the alto. And similarly with the tenor and the bass. In Sacred Heart, those rules don't apply. In order to have this melodic freedom, they have to be crossing over. And I could show you, you can look through at your convenience and find any number of songs in which that's happening all the time. Typically, if the treble, the high part, if the melody is going up to a high note, then the treble is going to come in under that to give you harmony and to work with its own melody. So they're going to be alternating in that way. Less so with the alto. But the bass is, I think I've just demonstrated to you, and the song I sang is very melodic. I think what I say, my voice is gone after 2 days of singing. It's gone even before I got here. But I think you could see from that, there's really a rolling, lovely kind of melody all its own. So that's the ideal there. So back to the question. So this heavily melodic music, so many of these beautiful melodies that came down from folk songs are in that aura. And then the spiritual sustenance of it, the sense of community. Sacred Heart is wonderful community. It's not at all unusual to find what we found Saturday and Sunday, which is the feeding of the host, of the multitude, and putting up, I think Anna said they had to put up 55 visitors from here. Well, 55 people to put up in a city the size of Burlington is no small feat, especially when the core group, is small. So Sacred Heart singers bond together through this thing, and so I think that's been the big surprise for many people who come to Sacred Heart, is this marvelous sense of community. And it is now a very diverse community. It didn't used to be anything like that. In the South, people were typically all sort of, believed similar things and so on. We're here at St. Michael's, but I have to tell you, it was a little bit of a sight for me. I only went abroad twice, once over the border into Montreal, where you mentioned Bill Monroe earlier, Bill. Hugh McGraw led a quartet of us, and then a quartet of black singers led by the great Huey Williams from South Alabama, who was a National Heritage Fellow and a figure in Bill Moyer's powerful documentary, Amazing Grace. Anyway, the 8 of us, singing 4 and 4, alternated with Roy Acuff at the Expo in Montreal in 1971. And back then, everybody knew who Roy Acuff was, and nobody knew who Sacred Heart singers were. But anyway, what was the question I was answering?
About the diversity.
Diversity, thank you. And can't even recall. I was going to tell you an anecdote, I think, about that, but I can't think what it was.
Where was that concert at? Do you remember?
Oh, very well. Buckminster Fuller's Geodesic Dome.
Nice.
We were up in the dome singing, and some people would pass by and stop for a while and listen to us. And Roy Acuff was a charming guy. He and his Smoky Mountain Boys.
How is the shape note singing here in New England different? How is shape note different in different regions of the country here in New England versus the South?
That's a good question. Because it went to different places downtown. Let me back up and say what you probably already know about. Sacred Heart was published in Hamilton, Georgia, western Georgia, in 1844. So it's right there in this deep southern area, and yet it is drawing on music from Vermont and Boston and so on. It's early American music, plus then all these other things, the revival spiritual songs that came in, and then Southern composers beginning to do fuguing songs, which they really loved, which early American folks had done. Colonial America had done the fuguing songs. So the great William Billings, Daniel Reed, Justin Morgan of the Morgan Horse, and so on. The Southerners were attracted to that. But so it went to these various little pockets, and it's been interesting to me to find some of those pockets that were still in isolation. That's no longer possible. It might be true in South America, but it's not true in the U.S. anymore, because everybody has access to YouTube, and so you know what's going on in Cork and Bremen, Germany, and so on. But to stumble across what might be called a lost tonal tribe, like we found the Lee family in South Georgia, down in the Okefenokee swamp area, right over the border from Florida, and found that they had been singing since at least the 1860s, and in a separate way. I wish I had a recording to play for you. Very slow, very ornamented version of these Sacred Harp songs. And it is beautiful to hear them as a family, a really large family, with some intermarriage, a very large family singing so closely together with each other that they rounded off all the extraneous stuff and so on, and you just get this beautiful blend. They now have joined the bigger community and therefore thereby have given up some of what was distinctive about their music. So they now sing faster to sing along with the rest of us. They would still say things like, in their verses, would still pronounce early, for example. So he was still carrying over something from across the waters, Evri and Evri Evening. They would have on one of the recordings in my audiobook where we have them singing that, and Evri Evening. So the pronunciations were different. The same for northeastern Alabama with the great Wooten family. They were a family of extraordinary singers, and when I first knew them, there were 7 brothers and sisters, 5 brothers and 2 sisters. It's unparalleled in my existence to run across a family with those, their children, their children's children, their children's children, on down, where you can't find a single person who sings out of key, who's tone deaf. And they have beautiful voices. And so they had all they needed for just forever. And so they were very used to singing together. And they beat time in 4. That's their preferred, therefore it's slower music, because the 2-beat per measure thing takes you faster, but they're used to singing in 4 like this. And that shows an infusion of the 7-shape, the do-re-mi system, and the gospel music traditions coming in. But once again, they have been absorbed by the larger community. And it's been interesting to see people from all over the country, and now other parts of the world, go to South Georgia, the Okefenokee, and Northeast Alabama, where the Wootens are, to get to sing with those people because they've heard recordings of them, they've heard of their kind of music.
Being up here in Burlington for the weekend, do you hear regional differences in New England singers versus being down in Alabama?
Not so much.
Everything's so...
Not so much. People, there's so much, I've spoken in the book of the nomadic weekend singing life of people here, where they up and travel. I mean, any number of people were here this weekend from Pennsylvania. They had an 8 and 9 hour drive away. as well as flying in. And it's just that kind of thing is happening all over the country and now all over the world. I mentioned the singings in Cork, Ireland. A real tradition has sprung up there, and I think they've had maybe their 7th or 8th annual Sacred Heart singing, and it's now a real draw. And this past year, if you can believe it, 28 singers from the state of Minneapolis went over to sing at Cork. I mean, they took a singing, and we call it a singing rather than a sing, all right? Most Southerners do at any rate. Others in different traditions would speak of it as a sing, but to us it's a singing, like a reading or a meeting. It's one of those verbals that works for us. But I don't notice so much the difference. But because of all of that cross-pollination, you don't get as much difference anymore. And people who, particularly because the South has been the incubation area for this, that's like the Mecca. So you go there to find out, and originally to sing with wonderful groups of singers who were used to doing it, who were no longer sight reading. Now that's no longer the case. It's almost like the tail can be wagging the dog now, because people outside the South don't need Southern involvement or Southern singers at all. They're equally strong. And I think when you were all there on Saturday, you can't say that was a weak appearance of anything. One, that it was very, very strong, and obviously it could be, self-sustaining kind of thing. There's some little regional differences you would find. Southern singers often say that one difference is that singers outside the South don't sing with as much accent as traditional singers do in the South. And Nathan Reese, who came up, he's an art history professor at the University of West Georgia, and he came up and did a session Friday evening along with me, and he addressed the issue of accent, telling people how to sing. So what you're striving for, once again, you're singing without instrumental accompaniment. So, and you want the group to all sing together, and you want it to be energized. And so singing with a strong accent on the first beat of every measure, and a minor accent on the third beat. Fa, 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 fa. And that gives it that pulsing sound that allows you to carry it forward. So Northern singers whose orientation before they came to Sacred Heart has been choral singing or something, are more used to that flowing kind of sound where you're not giving that. But certainly, I think for most of those singers, the strong pulsing singing has a real appeal, but they haven't maybe quite adapted that to the extent that the Southerners do. And particularly, when I listen back to old recordings of the Southerners, it's very strong to hear that.
How do you feel, given regional idiosyncrasies versus a more homogeneous sound, yet it's more popular now than ever, so it's kind of a trade-off, right?
Definitely is. It definitely is. And a good many young singers today, millennials, actually prefer the old, rougher sound from the recordings of traditional Southern singers. It's like a fiddle versus a violin kind of thing, But I have to say, I love the sound today. I'm maybe not enough of a purist as much as my young friends are. I love the beauty of the down south. You sang Sacred Heart because you were born into it. Everybody in the family did. Everywhere else now, people are self-selected singers. So they typically come to us who are already people who like to sing and who are good at it. And typically, we don't have people who have been told all their lives, you're singing a little out of tune. We don't get many of those.
We've been talking in class a lot about the meaning of authenticity. Mm-hmm. So how has that changed with globalization and kind of for Shape Note, and how has that definition changed, or has it changed for today's Shape Note?
Yeah. That almost sounds like a graduate level class question, but I'll try to attempt it.
I'm an instructor.
Yeah, we were instructed to ask it.
One of the interesting things to me over the years, I have reached out to a great many young singers who have come to us, or singers who new have come to us, and I find almost always a real deference to the traditional way of doing things, up to the point of, like those purists who would go to a national park and don't want to step off the path or do anything else that would mar what is there. They don't want to trample on anything. And I find that, and it's reassuring and beautiful to see among the people who newly come to Sacred Heart, that they would like it to stay the way it's been. They don't want, by their presence, by the differences that they bring naturally to it, to mar what was there. They don't want to veer off from that tradition. And that's impressive to me, and I think that's a quality of the young today, that they have a real reverence for the environment and so on, and that carries over to this singing tradition and environment. I'm not sure I'm really getting at your question, Alex, but maybe that'll. I can't get enough water. We traced around Sherburne Farms this morning, had breakfast there, and I did go a little heavy on the bacon. And we were out among the cattle and so on, so I just can't get hydrated sufficiently. Thanks again, Bill, for this water.
Can never have too much bacon.
What do you think will be gained from keeping Shape Note alive? What do you think will be gained from preserving it?
Well, I'll try to stay on task here. First of all, from the first, Sacred Heart singing has been community singing. And that was much more to be expected in the era in which it came along and evolved. But there would be few examples of that kind of thing these days. Everybody is listening to music and have been for a very long time, but they're not so much doing that. So something which brings together a whole community of people to do this one thing, which is itself a bonding experience, this marvelous kind of sharing and making and hearing the music. So I think if that goes away, and I'd say the odds are decreasing now, the way it's springing up in all these far ports and so on. I think that would be one of the losses, is that we would lose that communal experience that we had, rather than going to a concert. And I know it's great to shout and with all your buddies, but somehow this other is qualitatively, I think, a different thing. We would lose a ritualized tradition that has been, going on for a couple of 100 years now. I mean, the very terminology that we use today, the group of singers, you may know this already, the group of singers yesterday or anywhere is always referred to as the class. The person who stands before you leads a lesson. Those are two of the terms left over from the singing schools, the New England, the colonial singing schools, and the Southern singing schools that came along later. So the idea that, in a sense, we're all still learning, and this very democratic thing, that's another thing I think we would lose. The fact that every day today, you don't have to, but you're certainly encouraged to lead a song, to select your own song, and to give your preferences about how it is supposed to go. Then maybe the loss of that kind of polyphony, that the harmonies, and so many of these wonderful melodies that have been around for so long. I think we would lose all of that. And as I said, I used to worry about that, because down south it looked increasingly clear that the Sacred Heart was not going to survive. And now I never saw this spread outside that people would be singing it in Australia and so on. And now they are.
And so you've seen waves of revivalism.
Yes, waves of it. Yeah. And once again, the movie Cold Mountain. Did any of you ever seen that or familiar with it? I guess, which is it, the National Book Award or something? Fraser got for writing that book. Was made into a movie in 2003. And just a quick, I was one of a group of 60 singers who were invited to at a little church in Henniger, Alabama, in northeast Alabama. Henniger was just kind of a spot in the road, to record songs to be used in the movie Cold Mountain, which is a Civil War story. And Anthony Minghella was the English director who directed the movie The English Patient and others, and then he directed Cold Mountain. And Nicole Kidman and Jude Law were in it. Brendan Gleeson, who was in Braveheart. And Brendan Gleeson came down for the recording session, and Minghella was there. The composer's name, I can't bring it to mind at the moment, was there. Anyway, they recorded us for 2 hours. And by the way, we took a break and went out and had a fabulous little supper on the underneath the trees and the overhanging situation there. And for each of us, they peeled off 2 crisp $100 bills. Nothing in Hollywood can be free. You have to be paid for everything. And so they recorded us. And 2 of the songs made it into the movie Cold Mountain. And the Battle of the Crater, one of those famous Civil War battles, they bring up this haunting Sacred Heart song. If you look at a book, it will be page 47 on the bottom, and it's a very famous song, And Am I Born to Die? And a minor song, And am I born to die, to lay this body down, and so on. And you have very strong harmony with a soaring treble and a very powerful alto. And they chose that song to be the backdrop for the Battle of the Crater scene. And the original plan was just to bring all the other sound down and just turn up this harrowing sound of the Sacred Heart group singing the shape notes first and then this haunting song. The sound effects guys just went nuts. So they won out. They got to hear the crashing of the swords and the muskets, and so on. And then one other song. And we went out to a group of 30 of us, I guess, were invited to the Academy Awards in 2004 to perform. And we backed up Alison Krauss singing one of the nominated songs from Cold Mountain, which didn't win. Lord of the Rings won everything that night. But anyway, there, you got to see Julie Andrews and, all these other fabulous characters. That movie, though, brought us more new singers than anything else at that time. That was a real breakthrough for us nationally. I've forgotten what my question was that sent me off into that, but
just talking about how there always seems to be these subsequent waves of revivalism that happens.
That was one. That was a big burst. Tim Erickson played the voice of. He had the voice of Stabrod in that movie, and he is a performer and performs internationally. And so we got a lot from that. And then, once again, I think the use of Sacred Harp on YouTube has just taken it to another level. So many cases now, we have someone back home that I know who stumbled, as many others have, who stumbled across Sacred Harp on YouTube looking for something else. And just by chance, you pull up this one song. It either connects or it doesn't. The percentage is small, but internationally, it's going to be really large. And so that's another one of those waves that's happening.
You had mentioned earlier that while we were there, you had said you don't have to do it, but you believe everyone should be able to lead a song. On Saturday, I led a song.
Oh, great.
It was 159, Wondrous Love.
Wondrous Love.
The reason why I chose that one is because Talia and I are actually cast in an original musical called Mill Girls, and we're singing Wondrous Love. And it's more of a melodic version than what the actual Sacred Harp one is. And I wanted to know the difference between them. And it was very interesting it was intimidating to be in the middle.
Always,
but
yes.
It was really interesting to hear the difference between what I had learned and what I learned was very close to the tenor part.
Right.
And because I'm a soprano, and so it was moved up to the soprano. Right. And it was really interesting to hear the contrast of what I knew as a more melodic four-part to the more like structured,
yes, and then with those harmonies hitting you, yeah. Wondrous Love is just one of the classics in Sacred Harp.
Would you have any advice for us particularly, or anybody singing anything that was adapted from Sacred Harp?
No, all kinds of things have been done with it. Matt Hinton, who did a well-known documentary about Sacred Harp called Awake My Soul, produced an album of Sacred Harp songs sung by various music groups, individuals and groups, who took Sacred Harp and he just allowed them to do anything with it they wanted. So you get all kinds of variations of that, and that was successful. So I'm sorry to say I don't really have any advice. I'm sure it'll be good.
We're also singing one. It's titled Captain Kidd, but the first words are Through All the World Below.
Yes.
Do you know that one?
I remember it from years ago. Yes.
That one sounds, by the structure of Sacred Harp, it has the contrasting melodies and parts that overlap each other. And it's, when we first learned it, it was really hard because he tried to figure out which part was more of the sopranos and altos. And neither of them were really either, because both of them go fairly high. But our part, I think, is the melody. It's really interesting.
What are some of the challenges that you face when you lead in like a new group of people that you've never sung with before?
That's a good. It's hard right now to find a group of singers who aren't already familiar with the traditional way of doing things. 30 or 40 years ago, you might have stumbled across a group of people who had been singing in isolation, let's say, and they had developed their own way of doing things. For example, they might not keep time the way we do. They might let their phrases kind of die and then start again, like just a group of people sitting around in a circle singing. So you would have some challenges with that to bridge that gap between what they were doing and what you now wanted them to do. As I say, increasingly, I wouldn't be finding that because everybody now listens to all of the recordings of how singers do it, and for the most part, they are preferring things. Certain songs will lend themselves to being sung slow by some groups or by some people, and then much faster by others. But I don't really find that now. Working with a group of people who haven't sung Sacred Harp before is a real challenge, and I'm afraid it's going to be a real challenge for me this afternoon, Bill. But we'll see how we go.
Shall I do a question?
Oh, yeah. I was just wondering if Shape Note or Sacred Heart has always been as egalitarian as it is today.
Yes and no. To start with, Sacred Heart began in a time when many more people sang it than today. You can go back to the newspaper accounts of the time, and following, let's say, in the South, following the Civil War, there would be 5,000 or 6,000 people estimated at a singing. At one, they drank 3 wells dry during this 3-day convention. At a singing like that, it's clearly not possible for everybody to lead. Only the best led, the real singing masters. And they were typically given a half hour to lead. So they had great power over what was sung, and you just simply saw the best, and there was never a downtime from that. Over time, it became increasingly more egalitarian, with fewer singers and more adept singers by being able to lead. Around the end of the 19th century, you began to see women lead at big conventions, which was something new. So it progressed. And one of the things I think that's helped that whole thing is that for its own survival, the big singing organizations were always called conventions. That was a 1-day singing would not be a convention, but a 2 or 3 day. And most of the conventions originally were 3-day conventions. People didn't work in the office on Friday anyway. They were farmers and so on, right? So after crop lay-by time, they would have these 3-day conventions. And these conventions would adopt a constitution and bylaws. And almost to a one, they would include language to it like this. This convention shall have no, anyway, these are not exactly the words, but shall have no opinion about the various opinions that divide the public. And so what you got from that is they were telling you no politics and no religion. That's the only way we're going to be able to sing in harmony is if we're not at each other's throats. That would have made for some very keen trouble if they had been doing that at the time, but that would have been about all. So again, in their wisdom, they saw that let's leave those things aside that would divide us. And so increasingly that allowed everybody to be, to have a relatively equal place and for people to feel welcome to come and do that. Whereas if it were more doctrinaire in any way, that would not have been possible. That's something we've tried to keep going today. And it's much more important now because of the great diversity that we have. So, and I think it's never been more egalitarian than it is now.
And that freedom, of course, you can find as well in just the part you choose to sing. There's wonderful sort of openness there too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what you often find is people moving from part to part during the day. Their voice tires, they want to try something different, and so on. So,
How has the shape note changed for you over your career singing? And what does it mean to you? How is it different than what it did years ago?
Well, constitutionally, the young people, the proportion of young people is phenomenally different than when I started. So that's the basic thing that occurs to me to say. When I started singing, there was just almost no young people. I was one of the few of my age at that time, and except for some families that brought their singing family members along with them. There weren't any newbies. You were just kind of born into it. And today, the fact that we have, this infusion, and the demographics have changed, because once again, the Southerners, the farmers, the agricultural people, and so on, and now doctors and lawyers everywhere, scientists and so on. So the demographics, I would say that's maybe the biggest thing. The sound, as I mentioned, has changed a little. I think it's gotten more, quote, beautiful. It's not as raw as it used to be. And once again, that's not to the preference of some of the younger singers who really want to be sticklers for that, how they used to sing in the 20s and the 30s. Yeah.
Regarding terminology, fossil law, sacred heart, you prefer sacred heart. Any particular reason?
No, I mean, fossil law doesn't. It's a little more down home, Certainly, many people down south who don't sing Sacred Heart refer to it as fossil law, but it's not a pejorative. But I don't know, just Sacred Heart is more the generic. We've talked about the fact that shape note, which is a broader term, of course, which picks up other traditions, the seven shape, the do, re, mi folks, and so on, is preferred by some people because they're afraid that sacred and Sacred Heart would scare off people, the more secular approach to things, that might be a little intimidating or frightening to them, off-putting, I guess is the better way of putting it. But I don't know. Sacred Heart to me is just the right generic.
So it tells people you're coming from the four-note tradition.
Yes, absolutely. And I just can't wrap my mind around all the three shapes. It's only three, but I mean, I saw Sound of Music, and I know a deer and all of that, but it just it's more difficult to sing. It's too complicated for me, Bill.
Why do you continue to practice shape note?
Well, I don't actually practice. And a cute little story I think I could tell you. A number of years ago, I hosted the National Convention in Birmingham, National Sacred Heart Convention in Birmingham, which has been going for 38 years. And we sent a publicity package to the local arts director. He didn't come for a few years, the newspaper arts editor. At some point he called me and we talked, and he said, well, could I come by for one of your rehearsals? And I had to say, I'm sorry, we don't rehearse. We probably should, but we don't. We just do it. So it's just a happening. And isn't that one of the things that is appealing about it? You don't have to sing something 23 times to get, I mean, that's nice and it has its place and so on. But instead, you get to sing 90 songs when you get together, not the same 90 you sang yesterday.
Any other questions? I should wrap it up here.
Yeah, John.
Are there any songs still being written?
Absolutely. Right now, there is a lot of composition going on in Sacred Heart. And the Sacred Heart Publishing Company is looking at doing a new revision, which will tap some of that. The last edition, the 1991, gave us some songs that are already classics, that we know are going to be around for a long time because they're just so good. So there's a lot of interest in that right now. And, we would insist on it being the formal way, and that is that every minor song ends the final chord without a third in it. That it's the open sound. That is you will not find a single minor song in the book that ends other than the first and the fifth.
And there's also the tradition of bringing new texts into existing songs as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Everybody, Mr. Cobb, thank you so much.
I'm so glad you all got to come on Saturday, and I would say, come again. Thank you.
All right, guys. Good job. So, Mary and Derek, can you just send me those files so I can post them on Canvas? And then when we meet on Wednesday,